What if I told you that every 80 years, a superpower rises and then falls, and with it, its entire financial system? It sounds like the plot of a dystopian movie, but here's the shocking truth. This is exactly what's happening right now. The United States is standing at the edge of a massive economic collapse, and the signs are everywhere. While the world gets distracted by politics, wars, and headlines, the real threat is silently growing in the background. We are on the verge of a financial reset, one that could wipe out the wealth of millions of people, and it's already too late to stop. This isn't a doomsday theory. It's a repeating cycle of history that we're already witnessing. The US is following the same exact path that every superpower before it has taken. From Rome to Britain, every empire has gone through the same rise and fall. And now it's America's turn, so how do we know this collapse is coming? The truth is, it's already happening. Financial markets are more fragile than they've ever been, and the US dollar, once the most powerful currency in the world, is on its way to losing its global status. We've reached the tipping point, and here's the scariest part. It's all by design. In this video, we're going to show you the history behind these financial collapses, and how the US is repeating the same deadly cycle. We'll break down exactly why this collapse isn't just possible, it's inevitable. And most importantly, we'll give you the tools and knowledge to prepare for what's coming next. Because when the system collapses, only the ones who understand the pattern will survive. Let's rewind and take a look at how we got here. The cycle of financial collapse has been happening for centuries. It all starts the same way. A nation becomes the world's dominant power, builds massive wealth, and everything seems unstoppable. But as the empire grows, so does its debt. At first, the debt seems manageable. Then, it becomes uncontrollable. Eventually, the nation borrows so much money that it can no longer afford to pay its debts, and then everything crashes. In 1781, the US was drowning in revolutionary debt. The first currency, the continental dollar, which was supposed to stabilize the economy, hyperinflated and collapsed to absolute zero. The phrase "not worth a continental" became a symbol of failure. And just like that, the first financial collapse of America happened. Fast forward exactly 80 years to 1861. The US is on the brink of bankruptcy again, this time due to the Civil War. To finance the war, the government suspended the gold standard and printed greenbacks paper money with no backing. The currency devalued, and once again, the system broke down. Then came 1944, just after World War II, when the US dollar became the global reserve currency at the Bretton Woods Conference. The US was now the world's economic king, its currency tied to gold, and the entire global financial system was built on the strength of the US dollar. But now, as we approach 2024, the 80-year cycle is complete. The debt has become unmanageable. The global system is no longer sustainable. And we're about to witness the same collapse that has occurred in every empire before us. You might be wondering, how does this happen again and again? It's all part of a natural cycle. Empires rise because they create wealth, establish a strong economy, and maintain control of the financial system. But as time goes on, the wealth that was once created is spent recklessly. The desire for luxury and excess takes over, and debt grows faster than production. We stop investing in real assets and instead finance our consumption through debt. This is where the downfall begins. In 1971, the US government severed the link between the dollar and gold. This was the moment when the financial system lost its discipline. Politicians could now promise endless prosperity, fight wars without raising taxes, and create welfare states without savings. The money supply grew rapidly, but real wealth creation didn't keep up. The debt ballooned, but asset prices soared, creating the illusion of success. By the time the 2000s arrived, the US economy was no longer about producing goods. It became a machine for moving paper stock prices, real estate, and financial assets. The foundation of the economy began to rot, but the illusion of wealth continued. Fast forward to today, and the US dollar is no longer the same. The world is already questioning its dominance. Nations are turning away from the dollar, looking for alternatives. This is exactly what happened to previous empires. The Dutch, the British, and now the US are all victims of the same cycle. The Dutch Empire in the 1600s was once the world's financial capital. They had the world's strongest navy, the best technology, and controlled global trade. But just like America, their success made them complacent. As they grew wealthier, they stopped being the factory of the world and became the bankers of the world. They shifted from producing goods to speculating on money. Their stock market boomed, but so did the inequality. Eventually, the Dutch economy collapsed, and the British Empire took over. The same thing happened to Britain after World War I. They were once the global financial powerhouse, but after 2 world wars, Britain was financially destroyed. In the 1940s, their debt-to-GDP ratio skyrocketed to 250%. By 1976, Britain had to go to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for a bailout. Does that sound impossible? Well, the same thing could happen to America. America is now on the same path. We've crossed the point of no return. The US government spends more on debt interest than on national defense. That's right. The cost to service the national debt has surpassed the cost of keeping the military strong. This is the death cross, and it signals that the system is on the brink of collapse. The government is now borrowing more money just to pay off interest on its existing debt. This creates a vicious cycle where the debt becomes self-perpetuating. And it's not just a problem for the government. When the dollar loses its global status, it affects everyone. Prices will skyrocket, inflation will soar, and the wealth of millions will disappear. But there's still time to prepare. If you understand the pattern, you can protect yourself. The storm is coming. The question is, will you be ready when it hits? We've already seen this cycle play out in history. Now, let's look at what happens when an empire reaches its breaking point. The US dollar was once the most trusted currency in the world, but now it's facing a crisis of confidence. The world is beginning to shift away from the dollar, and that's going to cause massive upheaval. Think about this. For the first time in history, the US government is spending more on paying the interest on its debt than on its military. This is a warning sign that the system is broken. The US is no longer investing in its future. Instead, it's paying rent on its past mistakes. If you think this is just a temporary issue, think again. This is the beginning of a massive economic shift. As countries around the world start moving away from the US dollar, it's going to trigger an economic earthquake. The US has relied on the dollar's reserve currency status to maintain its global influence. But as trust in the dollar fades, so does America's power. The shift has already begun. In recent years, China, Russia, and other nations have started reducing their holdings of US debt. China, once the US's biggest creditor, has slashed its holdings of treasury bonds from $1.3 trillion to just $759 billion. That's a massive drop, and it's just the beginning. These countries are preparing for a world where the dollar is no longer the king of global trade. Instead, they're buying up gold at an unprecedented rate. In fact, central banks around the world have bought over 1,000 tons of gold annually for the past 3 years. This isn't some random shift. It's a deliberate move to protect their economies from the coming collapse of the dollar. And when these countries stop buying US debt, who's left to buy it? The Federal Reserve will have no choice but to print money to buy the bonds that no one else wants. This is exactly what happens when a country's debt becomes unsustainable. The government prints more money, causing inflation to skyrocket. This is the point where the financial system collapses. The world moves away from the dollar, and the US is left holding the bag. The death cross of debt has already crossed, and it's only a matter of time before the rest of the world makes its move. But let's go even deeper. In the 1970s, the US government made a fatal mistake. They severed the dollar's link to gold. This was a move that removed the last safeguard in the financial system. Once the dollar was no longer backed by gold, there was nothing stopping the government from printing as much money as it wanted. Fast forward to today. We are now living in a world where currency is created out of thin air. The US government spends trillions of dollars, and what do they have to show for it? Inflation. Higher prices for everything. A dollar that's worth less than it was before. It's easy to see the impact in everyday life. Your dollar doesn't go as far as it used to. What you could buy with $100 a decade ago now costs $150. And it's only going to get worse. The inflationary floor is the reality we now live in. Prices won't go back to what they were in 2019. That $8 carton of eggs isn't expensive. That's just the new reality of a weakened dollar. The Federal Reserve has flooded the economy with 40% more dollars in the last few years. This isn't free money, it's a devaluation of your savings, your income, and your purchasing power. But the real question is, when will it all collapse? The short answer: soon. The clock is ticking, and there are only so many ways to delay the inevitable. At some point, the debt will become unmanageable. And when that happens, the world will turn its back on the dollar. The rest of the world is already looking for alternatives. Countries like China and Russia are establishing new payment systems that bypass the dollar. The global oil trade is slowly moving away from the petrodollar. Nations are buying up assets that can't be printed, like gold, real estate, and Bitcoin. These are the safe havens, the stores of value that will survive when the US dollar crumbles. So what does this mean for you? The financial collapse of the US dollar is inevitable. It's not a question of if, but when. And when that moment comes, the wealth of millions will be wiped out in an instant. But here's the good news, there's still time to prepare. Understanding the patterns, the cycles, and what's coming next will put you in a stronger position to weather the storm. The signs are all around us now. The world is beginning to shift away from the US dollar. Countries that once relied on the dollar as the global reserve currency are now looking for alternatives. China, Russia, and even nations within the European Union are slowly moving away from their dollar dependence. They are building alternative payment systems, and these systems don't involve the US dollar. This is not just a theoretical shift, it's happening right now. But here's the thing, the US didn't see this coming. We were so used to being at the center of the global financial system that we didn't even notice the world moving away from us. But now the rest of the world is making its move. They are turning their back on the dollar. And in doing so, they are setting the stage for a massive financial shift. The US government is still relying on the reserve currency status of the dollar. But this status is slipping away and the signs are becoming more visible every day. China has been hoarding gold like never before. Over the last 3 years, central banks around the world have purchased over 1,000 tons of gold annually. This isn't just diversification, it is a panic buying spree in anticipation of a world where the dollar no longer holds its value. And while the US government continues to print dollars, the rest of the world is building systems that don't require it. The power dynamics are shifting, and the dollar is losing its grip. In the past, the US could count on the world's reliance on the dollar to fund its debt. But as nations begin to de-dollarize, the US will have to rely on its own printing press more and more. This is where things get dangerous. The Federal Reserve will have no choice but to print money to buy up US debt that no one else wants. It will be a flood of new dollars, and with it, inflation will go through the roof. When the value of the dollar decreases, everything becomes more expensive. Food prices will rise. Gas will become even more costly. And that's just the beginning. The collapse of the dollar will lead to a global crisis. People who have their wealth tied up in the dollar will see their savings evaporate. Retirement funds, savings accounts, investments, everything tied to the dollar will lose its value. But there's a bigger problem. When the dollar crashes, it's not just the economy that's affected. The entire global financial system will come crashing down. The US government will be forced to either default on its debt or print money at an even faster rate, causing more inflation. The world's financial institutions are tied to the dollar, and when it goes, the domino effect will be catastrophic. Now let's take a step back. How did we get here? How did the world's most powerful economy end up on the brink of collapse? It all goes back to one key moment in history. In 1971, the US government made the fatal decision to sever the dollar's link to gold. This was the moment when the US lost its discipline in managing money. When the dollar was tied to gold, the government couldn't print money without consequences. But once that link was broken, the government had free rein to print as much money as it wanted. This is when the money printer started to run unchecked. And since then, the US has been devaluing its currency by printing more and more dollars. By the time we reached the 2000s, we had become a financialized economy. We stopped producing goods and started moving money around. The financial sector grew while the real economy stagnated. We created a world of paper wealth, where the value of stocks, real estate, and other financial assets continued to rise. But beneath the surface, the economy was rotting. We became addicted to debt, using it to fund luxuries instead of investing in real growth. Fast forward to today. The US is facing a massive debt crisis. The government is in deep debt, trillions of dollars in obligations that it can't pay off. And the only way out of this mess is to devalue the currency. When the value of the dollar drops, it makes the debt easier to pay off, but it also erodes the purchasing power of the people. Everything costs more. Your savings lose their value, and the wealth gap continues to widen. What happens next is a domino effect. As the US dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency, countries around the globe will start to restructure their economies to rely less on the dollar. Countries like China and Russia are already setting up alternative payment systems to bypass the dollar. In fact, China is already establishing a digital yuan, which could eventually replace the dollar in international trade. This shift is happening quietly, but it's happening fast. Meanwhile, as inflation rises in the US, the Federal Reserve will have to continue printing money. But the more it prints, the less the dollar is worth. The only way the US can get out of this mess is through a massive reset of the global financial system. But how can they do that without causing chaos? The answer lies in a new currency, a global digital currency that could replace the US dollar. This digital currency would be controlled by central banks and would allow them to manage the global economy in ways that are impossible with the current system. In the coming years, we may see the US government push for a digital dollar, one that would allow them to track every transaction and manage the economy more directly. But this system will come at a price. Privacy will be a thing of the past, and central banks will have complete control over your money. This is the future we are headed towards, a world where money is controlled by those in power. As the global shift away from the US dollar continues, the world will face unprecedented economic turbulence. We're talking about a complete breakdown of the current financial system, one that has been in place since World War II, when the dollar no longer holds its place as the world's reserve currency. Everything changes. The power that the United States has relied on for decades will evaporate, and we'll witness a seismic shift in global power. But this is only the beginning. The real damage will come when the system resets. For years, the US has relied on the dollar's reserve currency status to maintain its power. Other nations have been forced to hold dollars as reserves, keeping the currency in high demand. But as countries like China, Russia, and even parts of the European Union start to ditch the dollar, the rules of the game will change. The world's economies will begin to decouple from the US dollar, and the consequences of that decoupling will be massive. The US government has been running a massive debt machine for decades. Right now, the national debt stands at over $30 trillion, and it continues to grow. But here's the kicker: the government is not paying off its debt, it's borrowing more to pay off the interest on the previous debt. This creates a vicious cycle. The government borrows to pay off the debt, and then borrows more to pay off the new debt. The debt keeps growing, but the ability to repay it shrinks. This is what happens when a country's debt becomes unsustainable. It becomes a self-perpetuating loop. As the US continues to borrow and print money, the value of the dollar will continue to decline. The Federal Reserve will print more money to keep the system afloat, but each new dollar will be worth less than the last. This leads to hyperinflation, where the value of your money decreases so rapidly that you can no longer buy the things you need. Imagine paying $100 for groceries today, but tomorrow, the same groceries cost $200. This isn't a fantasy, it's the reality we're headed towards. The next step in this financial collapse will be a global currency reset. When the US dollar loses its place as the global reserve currency, countries will need a new way to trade. Central banks are already laying the groundwork for this reset. China, for example, is rapidly building its own digital currency, the digital yuan, and it's already being used in international trade. Countries that have traditionally relied on the US dollar will start adopting alternatives. We will see the rise of alternative reserve currencies, and the US dollar will be sidelined. The digital dollar is another possibility. Central banks around the world are exploring digital currencies as a way to gain more control over the global economy. But this digital currency will come with massive trade-offs. It will allow governments to track every transaction, monitor every penny you spend, and give them ultimate control over the flow of money. You'll have no privacy when it comes to your financial life. Every transaction will be recorded. Every purchase you make will be monitored. And it's not just about surveillance. A digital dollar could be programmable, which means governments could decide what you can and cannot spend your money on. This new currency system will be sold to the public as a way to solve the problems of inflation and debt. But in reality, it will be a way for central banks to tighten their grip on the economy and ensure they remain in power. The days of financial freedom will be over. When the government controls your money, it controls your life. And once this system is in place, it will be nearly impossible to reverse. As the US dollar collapses and the global economy resets, we will enter a period of massive financial upheaval. Stock markets will crash, real estate prices will plummet. The retirement savings of millions will be wiped out. But not everyone will be affected equally. Those who understand what is happening and take the right steps to prepare will not only survive, they will thrive. The shift in global power won't just be economic. It will be political, cultural, and social. The nations that move away from the dollar first will emerge stronger. They will have their own financial systems in place, backed by hard assets like gold and commodities. The countries that hold on to the dollar for too long will suffer the most. They will be trapped in a collapsing system, unable to escape the damage. It's already happening. China and Russia have been making strategic moves to diversify away from the dollar for years. The world is already changing, and the US is slowly being left behind. But the most dangerous part of this collapse isn't just the economic damage, it has the social impact. When people lose faith in the financial system, they lose faith in everything. We are already seeing the rise of populism on both the left and the right. People are frustrated. They see the system as rigged. And when that frustration turns to anger, the entire social contract begins to fall apart. We saw this in the 1930s, when the financial collapse led to fascism in Europe and radical reforms in the US. The same thing could happen again. The chaos that follows a financial collapse can bring about drastic political and social changes. So what's next? The dollar is in its final stages. The financial system is on borrowed time, and the world is already preparing for a new financial era. The only question is, how will you prepare? As we reach the final chapter of this story, we must ask ourselves, what happens when the world's financial system collapses? Will the United States remain in control, or will it join the ranks of fallen empires? The truth is, the collapse of the dollar is inevitable. The global shift is already underway, and as the US dollar loses its dominance, we are going to witness a new world order emerge. This isn't a warning for the far-off future. This is happening now, and the signs are everywhere. The US has already reached the tipping point. The national debt has spiraled out of control, and the government is now spending more on paying off interest than on securing the nation's future. The global economy is decoupling from the US dollar, and the digital currencies, gold reserves, and alternative payment systems are gaining strength. As the dollar collapses, we will see a ripple effect across all financial markets. Stocks, bonds, real estate, everything tied to the dollar will lose its value. But there's a way to protect yourself. We've talked about hard assets, gold, land, and even cryptocurrencies assets that can survive the financial storm. Diversifying your wealth away from the dollar into these tangible assets could be the key to weathering this coming storm. But beyond the financial strategies, there's an even bigger question. What will the future look like when the digital dollar becomes the new reality? A world where privacy is gone and your money is controlled by central authorities. A world where your financial freedom is limited by what the government allows. How will this affect the way we live, work, and interact with the world around us? As the world shifts toward a new financial system, it's essential to ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to live in? A world where you have control over your wealth and financial future? Or a world where your every transaction is monitored and your financial freedom is dictated by the government? The clock is ticking and the storm is coming. The collapse of the dollar is inevitable. But you have a choice. Will you be a victim of this collapse? Or will you take the necessary steps to survive and thrive in the new world that is emerging? Let us know what you think in the comments. What steps are you taking to prepare for the coming financial reset? And don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest information about the global economy, financial strategies, and how to navigate these uncertain times. Time is running out. What will you do to secure your financial future?